I was 16, I punched my art teacher. He ended up on the floor. Half an hour later, I ended up outside the school gates. What happened there was I disrupted a disruptive cycle. I had taken action into my own hands, and I had stopped what I saw to be an abuse. There was an abuse at play with the smaller kids in school, where violence was being used to control those children. But I'm not proud of what I did then. And in fact, my parents didn't understand that I was standing up for an injustice. My teachers didn't listen to my story. And as a result, I ended up at another school. But the school that I went to next was a very different school altogether. And my next school, instead of being based on command and control ways of keeping children at bay, it used a system that was based on trust and care. And I flourished in that school. For me, that was a school where my unique skills were allowed to be brought into bear so that I could stand up and do what I felt was best. That worked very well for me. It's perhaps no surprise that I have become a barrister, where instead of using violence to meet violence, I now use words as my tools. But here's the thing, I no longer fight in courts. In fact, what I've done is I've decided to represent just one client, and that is the earth. Quite some years ago, I decided I would step back and I would examine how is it that we have so normalized a system that's causing mass damage and destruction to the earth, because what I could see there was a cycle of damage and destruction that was playing out. And there was no way of disrupting it. How do we bring it to a halt? And this really bothered me. So what I did was I stepped back and I decided to examine what was it in law that was creating this problem. Now, what I discovered was that it is, in fact, the law for a CEO and directors to put the interests of their shareholders first. And what happens there is that they can cause mass damage and destruction as a result of corporate activity without looking to the consequences. That is the law. Somewhere along the line, law has failed to stop mass damage and destruction. I decided to take some time out. I decided to take a year out. That was 8 years ago, and I'm still on my year out. And I decided to examine this at an ever deeper level. In fact, I even called upon the United Nations to put in place an international law to protect the Earth's right to life. And it was when I was speaking on a platform not that dissimilar from this, some years ago, when I had a light bulb moment, when I realized that if we were to protect the Earth's right to life, then we would need an international crime of ecocide. In fact, an international crime of ecocide would not only protect nature's right to life, but humanity's right to life and future generations' right to life. This was a very powerful law. So what I did was, I subjected it to intense legal scrutiny. I went back to first principles to see whether or not this law would work, and what I discovered was, not only was this law necessary, but we could put it in place very simply. In fact, all it requires is an amendment to possibly the most important international legal document we have. It's known as the Rome Statute. The Rome Statute codifies what are known as collectively as crimes against peace. And they are crimes against humanity, war crimes, genocide, and crimes of aggression. Now, I didn't know it then when I proposed into the United Nations Law Commission back in 2010, but during the drafting of this document, it wasn't just 4 international crimes against peace that were on the table. Between the mid-1980s and 1990s, in fact, there was a 5th crime, and that was ecocide. It was part of the draft. Just imagine this. There were hundreds, if not thousands, of UN special rapporteurs, lawyers, member state representatives, and other related organizations who were all involved in this drafting process over a period of 10, 11 years. And ecocide was part of that document. I didn't know that at the time until, in fact, a journalist from the Baltic states got in touch and informed me of this fact. Now, this greatly excited me to discover that it has a history, a previous history, that here, at first instance, was an international crime of ecocide. But in 1996, it was literally wiped off the map. What were supposed to be the crimes against peace that would protect the well-being of all life had been reduced down to just 4 international crimes. I don't want that crime to disappear ever again. In fact, I believe that we can make sure that we can put this back in place. All that document requires is an amendment to put it back from where it once was. Many countries supported it first time round at first instance, and indeed many countries objected when it was removed. This is a crime that, had it been put in place back in 1996, had it actually been passed into law in 1998, we would no longer have deforestation. We would no longer have oil extraction. We would no longer have genetically modified organisms. We would no longer have nuclear. Just imagine what our world would look like now if that had already been put back in place. Instead, what we have is a cycle of damage and destruction playing out here that has echoes in what I saw playing out at school as a child. But instead of children being harmed and abused, what we're doing is we're causing great harm and abuse to the earth. Quite literally, damage and destruction leads to, amongst other things, resource depletion, which leads to conflict, which then leads to war, and this cycling is spiraling onwards and upwards faster and faster. But here's the thing, we can disrupt this cycle. We can literally halt it in its tracks. We can say, no more, we're going to stop that. And we can do that. We, the people, can make sure that that law is put in place once again. And we can stop this cycle from accruing and continuing and speeding up faster and faster. This is the beginnings of the proposal that I submitted into the United Nations Law Commission back in 2010. Since this law has been submitted, this amendment to the Rome Statute, my life has changed beyond all recognition. This proposal has taken me right across the world. Over the last year alone, I have advised 54 governments, that's ministers of state, that's UN ambassadors, and that's their legal advisors. In fact, I was invited by some nations to put together a concept paper as to how we could implement this law by 2020. We took that into every single government last year, right across the world. Everything I do is open sourced. We have an information portal online where everything's under a Creative Commons license, so you can download everything that's out there. There's now a draft Ecocide Act, which can be put in place by every country when this law is voted in. And in Europe, we have a fast-track system, whereby, for the first time ever, we, the people, can vote for a law of ecocide to be made here in Europe. So your vote counts here in Europe. But it's more than that. If you come from Australia, from Africa, from America, from Indonesia, from Micronesia, or anywhere else in between, we need your help with this. And we have a map on the information portal so that you can show and make visible your support. Because this is the thing, governments need a public mandate to stand up and say, enough, no more. We will put this law in place. But what I'd like to do is roll back the clock 200 years and take you back to a time where I can see that there are echoes of what is happening today and how it played out in history before. 200 years ago, what we did was we commoditized men and women just by dint of their color for being black. We branded them, we cauterized them, and we made them our property. We commoditized humanity. What we did there has parallels to what I saw in a smaller context back at school. We undervalued humanity, just as I at school and those smaller children were undervalued. This is what we did in a far larger context in the days of slavery. And when we do that and commoditize, in the case of here, humanity, we create great harm, which can lead to conflict, and it can lead to far worse. It's that cycle of damage and destruction playing out again. Now, the man who came along and broke that cycle, his name was William Wilberforce. He was a British parliamentarian, and he stood up and he said, no more. This must stop. What he recognized is that it did not work to commoditize humanity. But it wasn't just William Wilberforce who changed this. In fact, it was we the people. It was people right across the world standing up and giving voice on behalf of slaves. Now, slaves were beginning to rebel, but their voices weren't being heard. And instead, it was people in Britain and in other countries that stood up and spoke out. What happened there was that it created a public mandate for government to pass laws. In Britain, those laws that outlawed slavery were passed just 2 days before William Wilberforce died. He died a happy man. Now, here's the thing. Unlike in the times of William Wilberforce, when we're looking at today, when we're looking at mass damage and destruction to something else that's been enslaved, and that's the earth, we have a great advantage. We have Google, we have TED Talks, we have Facebook. Our ability to communicate is amplified in so many more ways. Now, at the time when William Wilberforce stood up and said, no more, this must stop, he was told, you can't stop this. Our world is based on slavery. It's a necessity. The public demand it. Get rid of slavery. It will lead to economic collapse. But you know what? None of that came true. In fact, many of the companies that were involved in slavery back then went on to trade in many other innovations, tea from China. Some of them became the policers of the seas. What is very interesting here is that it was a moment in time in history when civilization stood up and said, no more. This must end. We, the people, gave voice on behalf of humanity. Law is a very powerful tool. It can be a tool which can cause damage and destruction, or it can be a tool to affirm life rather than destroy life. What happened back in the days of slavery was that slaves were treated as a piece of property. We put a price tag on slaves and commoditized them. But look at the earth. We've done the same thing. We can change that. We can literally halt that cycle of harm. And we do that by becoming stewards, by becoming guardians, by becoming trustees. And that comes from a very different place. That comes from a place of care. What's known as a legal duty of care. Instead of I own, it becomes I owe a duty of care. Instead of the here and now and the profiteering within a 3-month cycle, we look 7 generations hence. We look to the longer term. We look to the consequences. But it's more than just changing a law. It's about leadership. And it's about leadership not just with heads of states. It's about leadership from me. And it's about leadership from all of you. Because what I'm doing is I'm asking you to literally step out of your comfort zone. Step over the edge of your comfort zone. Because you know, when you do that, magic does happen. I know that. I wouldn't be here today if I hadn't stepped out of my comfort zone. And I'm asking you to help me, you and your friends and your networks, to take this one big idea and share it right across the world. Because when we do that, something magical really can happen. This is the thing. My wish is to end ecocide. Now, I know we can do this, but I can't do this alone. My call is out to you to give me help, to share this one idea, an idea whose time has come. Because this is the thing, try and push down an idea over here, it tends to pop up over here. And this is an idea that's out there in a very big way. This time, it doesn't need to be removed off silently and out of the way. We can actually bring it to the fore all over again. This is about singing a new song. And singing a new song for the earth so well that others want to join. And I ask you today to come and join me in creating and singing that new song in a country that is known for its singing right across the world. Because when we sing that new song, we can bring peace to earth. Thank you.